Melissa Kaiser. She's an independent consultant in the anti-human trafficking field with extensive experience developing and maintaining multidisciplinary teams and building relations with tribal communities. She was the first human trafficking navigator for Eastern North Dakota, contracted with the North Dakota Human Trafficking Task Force, and the first victim witness specialist for the North Dakota Bureau of Criminal Investigations, where she helped create and integrated victim services and law enforcement programs. A licensed social worker with a degree from Minnesota State University, Moorhead, Melissa has been active in the North Dakota Human Trafficking Task Force since 2016, serving as chair of the Lived Experience Subcommittee and vice chair of the Labor Trafficking Subcommittees. Everybody, please help me welcome Miss Melissa Kaiser.
That was probably the best intro I've had. I love it. Thank you. And just to piggyback off of that fantastic intro, I started with the North Dakota Human Trafficking Task Force when it was first created in 2015. And so we received the Office for Victims of Crime, or OVC, federal grant to create and maintain a statewide task force. So I'm excited to learn from everyone here today as well, because I do see a lot of similarities just in some of the dynamics between North Dakota and the rural and the tribal piece and where you all live. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about is what I've learned over the last decade from working in North Dakota. And then since moving to Florida 2 years ago, I still contract with North Dakota, but now I help people really enhance or create their multidisciplinary teams around the country. And so just really like Doug, similar to Doug, able to compare and contrast a lot of MDTs and see what makes an MDT successful. So part of what I talk about today is not going to be earth-shattering information for you all. A lot of it is like trial and error from what I've learned, some of the same and or similar things as to what you're already doing, but that's the goal, right? Is to see what each task force or MDT is doing, and what are ways that we can grow and implement what's being done, and what are ways that even I can go back and share more about your task force and what you're doing. So at any point, please chime in. You all are the experts in your fields. You're all the experts in your communities. I'm simply sharing what I've learned, and would love for you all to chime in the chat box or ask questions, or whether you agree with the point or disagree. This is your space. So would want to welcome you to do that. Okay, let me get my PowerPoint up here. Okay, fantastic. So not, again, earth-shattering for you all, but the reason I put the definition of an MDT up here is I want everyone, and maybe this is something you're already doing, to start thinking more informally and creatively and out of the box with MDTs. Are MDTs a formal process and a formal response based on, maybe the children's advocacy centers or the child welfare response? Absolutely. We can also incorporate an MDT in an informal sense, where I might have a case and I know from this task force meeting or this coalition who I can call and who I can bring to the table to get a response for the victims as they come to our door, right? And so the idea is, not only do we have formal MDTs through the legal system, we can also have informal MDTs based on the relationships that all of you have here. And that is so important to respond to victims and survivors that we work with. I think for me, some major lessons learned in North Dakota. I was the first human trafficking navigator hired for the state. I was in that role for about 7 years before I moved, and now I'm in a different role because I obviously can't work with victims from North Dakota when I'm in Florida, and I can't facilitate and maintain the MDTs and the protocol in North Dakota. But I was the first point of contact for any suspected cases for a very long time. And I thought at the beginning I was doing everything as correctly as I possibly could, right? I got everyone to the table. We talked about what wasn't already happening in the community. We talked about what trafficking was. We communicated. We had a protocol in place. All of these great things were happening. But two big things happened for me that made me realize I was missing a big chunk. When I would go to communities that had tribal nations close by, I would invite everybody at the table together to talk about those things, or to create a protocol with everybody there at the table. But something really small that I had missed prior to doing that was when I was presenting it to, the community, I would talk about data and numbers and who's submitting numbers. And I would talk about obviously the disproportionate amount of Native youth and adults that were being trafficked, as you all know, right, compared to other demographics. And some Native communities were like, well, where are you getting these numbers, right? We weren't involved in this data. We didn't even know this data existed. And so that for me was a really eye-opening moment of like, wow, I already know that's an issue or a huge gap that you all face every day. And here I was contributing to the problem, not realizing it, of like, I wasn't even communicating necessarily with all of the reservations in the state about the data and how we can enhance it and all work together. The other thing I learned was I made the assumption that if a youth, regardless of where they're from, was located, I called that local Child Protective Services or CPS office, and kind of the rest played out, on that side of things. And specifically in North Dakota, I can speak to when I was doing that. We have a lot of Native youth that would run off of the reservation and end up in another community in a shelter. And I was, again, thinking I was following the protocol we created to contact that CPS with the community they ran to, but I wasn't taking the extra step to contact the tribal CPS or that jurisdiction that they came from and had that conversation or reported that, because I made the assumption that was being done. And there was a large disconnect in communication and protocol in general. And so it just helped me learn pretty quickly that I was still doing things wrong. And it was important to bring everyone to the table again to say, I'm contributing to the problem, right? There are some gaps here, and I want to enhance trust and collaboration, and I want to be a part of the solution and not continue to divide. So that is a lot of what I learned about MDTs pretty quickly, and had a lot of wonderful people willing to work with me and be patient through that process. Again, not surprising. The point of informal and formal MDTs is we want to have trust and cohesion when we respond to these cases. We want to be able to consult, and when, again, appropriate and with confidentiality in mind, be able to cooperate and share information to make cases more efficient, right? And to make that communication and response more streamlined. It's really helpful to have a point of contact. So if you all identify someone at midnight on a Friday, you know who exactly to call. And again, that can be in that informal sense too, of we just know each other. We have built those relationships and know who's going to help in these moments when we need it. Hence crisis response, right? Crisis response, and then protocol development, wraparound services for clients, of course, when we can wrap services around them and not expect them to go to each and every one of us and navigate the system on their own. We're going to be a lot more successful because we're working together to make sure we're wrapping around them. Again, in us bringing the services to them. In the event all of these things happen rather successfully, that's when we can have really great outcomes for the clients that we serve. Some really great resources here. Again, nothing earth-shattering, but the goal and the elements of an MDT is having an appropriate amount of cross-section of members. You guys are already doing that here, which is incredible to see. A lot of different disciplines that are being represented. So we have contact points and we have relationships built already. We understand what you are all doing here, right? You have a shared understanding and a vision for why you exist and why you're coming together. You are working on and have those roles and responsibilities, both for your organizations and coming together. You communicate at least on a monthly basis from what I know about you already. We want to be able to manage conflict. We all have different goals for how these cases should work. There's obviously a lot of complications sometimes with jurisdictional differences. Those things are going to come up. And so how can we still want to come together and work together at the end of the day, remembering it's not about us, but it's about the victims that we serve, right? Which comes with that mutual understanding and respect for our roles and goals are different sometimes. But at the end of the day, we're all here for the common goal of serving these victims. Obviously, we want to find and enhance the resources that we do or don't have, or create them if we can. And we want to ensure that we have some skilled leadership behind the MDTs and how they're ran and organized. And, in my experience, depending where you are at, what community, there's a lot of different people that could be involved. As you all know, it depends on that victim specifically. Oftentimes when I met with the victim, I would ask who they'd want involved. They would be invited to their meeting to talk about what are their goals, what questions do they have, who do they want at the table to be there for them, represent them, or maybe that knows a lot about what's going on. And so asking them who should be at the table and having the resources or options available hence the idea of wraparound services, right? We want to make sure we have access to a contact point from these different entities or organizations. So when clients or victims are asking for these things, or we know that these entities could be involved, we're already one step ahead because we know the individuals, we have built these relationships, and we can ensure that the victims get who they need to be in contact with in a quicker manner than perhaps we were doing before. I'm cruising through that part. Do you guys have any initial comments or questions or things you've seen play out differently? Okay. Things I have learned in a really healthy team, I saw that a lot of what made it healthy was keeping the momentum alive. So whether that was doing exactly what you are all doing, you are providing education to this group and you're doing it together. So you're keeping it on the forefront of people's minds. You're learning about new types of trafficking, different dynamics, different perspectives, and you're really increasing your network throughout the nation because we know that these victims are transient and having those connections is really, really valuable. So it really helps us keep the passion for the work and keeps everyone wanting to show up to this space and collaborate. And then maybe it's, 2 months from now, you say, oh, remember when Melissa was here, what should we talk about? What do we want to incorporate or not, right? You're collaborating after you have these trainings. And so you guys are already one step ahead of what I learned is just how to keep the momentum alive with your teams is training opportunities. And I would oftentimes bring in presenters. So if I was wanting people to learn and understand more about Native populations, I would connect with the resources within those reservations and have them train alongside of me. So doing that within your own networks of I'm not an expert in that culture, right? I'm not an expert in that community, but collaborating with and partnering with someone who is, again, enhances your team approach. And then you also include each other in the work that you're doing, which again, enhances a lot of that collaboration and expertise. Another thought too, do you guys as a group have a mission statement, right? There's many of you from many different communities and backgrounds. What do you all want, right? As a group and as a task force, and maybe you have that mission statement and maybe you don't want one. And in North Dakota, my teams were all very different. About half the state wanted a mission statement to say, when people come and go from all different walks of life and all different communities and backgrounds, all different cultures, we want them to all understand what our mission here is. And I had other teams and groups from different reservations or jurisdictions that were like, nope, we just want to go. We just want to do the protocol, do the work. We don't need a mission statement. We all know why we're here. So again, looking towards you guys to say, do these communities or do we want a mission statement? What are our expectations for this team, right? Those of us that are going to informally or formally respond and be available to victims, and assigning those tasks and follow up to each other and giving everyone some responsibility helps us all stay engaged and really have that underlying understanding of the mission, whether it's written or not. Of course, what you already did today, which is sharing your resources, is this a really great space to cross-discipline train on what resources all of you have? And not only that, but taking that back to your communities. One thing I found was another lesson learned for me is when I would go to reservations and talk about the services we had, there was a lot of concern or protection over those communities because they're like, look, people come in here and promise us grants all the time, right? We've had broken treaties for more years than you've been alive. And that was something I had to learn too, to understand why am I different? What am I offering? What resources do I have versus me coming to take something versus me coming and wanting credit for something or to say I did something and I didn't, right? And so I think having a really common goal and mission and understanding of what are you bringing to those communities as a support to what they're already doing, not coming in as the expert to take over. And so having a clear idea of where we can help, what resources we provide, and that we are here as a support. Call us when you need us. But again, we know that you're the experts in your own community. We just want to enhance what you're doing and be here for you. Social workers, we use a lot of acronyms. So PCTI, if you see that, is person-centered trauma informed. And so I think what I learned very quickly is a lot of people did not have person-centered trauma informed understanding of the work. So I do a ton of training on this as well, working with victims of all different backgrounds, ages, genders, sex, person-centered trauma-informed training helps us really enhance the responses. So when we would informally have a team meeting and say, hey, we have a victim we need to work with, who's going to respond to that, or who's doing the interview, who's going to work with that person, making sure that they have person-centered trauma-informed understanding of how to engage with that client or how to consider trauma when you're working with somebody. So having ongoing person-centered trauma-informed training, I found really beneficial to my team, especially law enforcement, who just could use some of these little random tips and tricks to help, during that interview and investigative process and that relationship building stage. Of course, human trafficking and multidisciplinary team trainings. How are you bringing this back to your own organizations? And the reason I bring this up is when I ran MDTs in North Dakota, there was a really incredible sheriff's deputy that was involved from a community, and he had been there for years. He was really engaged. He did incredible work with the victims and survivors we worked with. However, when he retired and I called his department and I said, hey, we're trying to replace Steve. Do you have a replacement for this team? And they all said, we have no idea what you're talking about. What human trafficking team? And I mean, we were at least 5 years in at this point, and his entire department didn't even know we existed. So my I guess frustration was like, man, if a beat cop from your organization or from that department, I should say, had a human trafficking case or call or suspicion, they didn't even know that to call us. And so I always talk about how are we going back to our own agencies and taking what you share and what you learn in this group and ensuring that new staff, right, have some onboarding and training, and that you're sharing the resource of what you all do here and giving people a contact point for when some cases or questions come up. They know that you all as this group exist and they can utilize you as a resource. And maybe that's them coming to talk about, again, of course, with confidentiality in mind, cases or issues that they're seeing, or they don't know who to contact, or they don't know how to work with victims. You all exist already, and they know that, and they see you as a resource for a variety of communities. Obvious reasons we want cultural competence training. And I think incorporating within cultural competence that historical generational trauma, so people understand how to work with individuals and what to consider in terms of trauma and in having informed approaches. I always think too about community assessments, and what I mean by that as an example. So if in North Dakota we had a youth show up, so someone under the age of 18 in our homeless shelter, if they were female, if they were associated with someone in the life, and if they were a Native youth, we kind of had this already red flag assumption that they probably have been trafficked in some type of dynamic way, shape, or form already. And so just as a team, it's so important to go and assess each community because they all look so different, to say, what about this community would make it kind of an automatic red flag that we would want to teach people or train people, that then they contact us as a group. For example, when I would work with communities that were either on or close to a reservation, that was the assessment, right? If they're a Native youth, female, they're on the run, and they have been associated with someone in the life in some capacity, we're already assessing them and working with them with trafficking or exploitation services. But in a community 1 hour south, it was a college community. So the focus or the assessment looked very different for sex and labor trafficking. We had another community that hit intersecting interstates and was the highest population community in North Dakota. So that trafficking looked different. And then you go 2 hours west and you had a town that had a state hospital, and they had a sex offender program there. And oftentimes those offenders would just relocate within that community. So that assessment of maybe some of the red flags or what we're looking for or concerned about in that community looks different. So just looking at each of the communities you come from to say, what are some specific things about this community that we want to make sure we're teaching people about and sharing resources for when suspected cases come up. And of course, when we're talking about being person-centered trauma informed, even talking in this group, what types of policies do we have that might hinder or trigger clients? For example, one issue that we had is a Native youth ended up in one of our shelters off the reservation, and we went to them trying to be person-centered and said, what would you like, right? Giving them that choice of what services would be helpful for you. And they said, well, I would really like a Native mentor and someone, to come like do art with me. what an incredible idea. And we had nothing for that. So here we're trying to be person-centered by saying, hey, what do you want? Let us meet you where you're at. And then we couldn't provide that, which hinders clients. Now, we've kind of promised them something we don't have at this moment. And B, we aren't able to meet them where they're at. We're hindering them from some of that healing by not having this resource or talking about what exists already. So looking at our own policies and being open to change how we do things, because we want our clients to come through our door and feel like we can be flexible and creative and open with them. And so how can we do a better job at that? And then in this group, teaching each other about that. What have we learned through our own policies? What has helped us? And then what are those next steps to making some changes internally? Comments, questions, thoughts? I'm going to stop and ask every once in a while because I know I'm talking fast.
Thank you so much for your information. And I can tell that you really care about what you do and about the victims that are being trafficked. What I wanted to say was included with the cultural perspectives is that a lot of the Native communities in the area have casinos. And it was my understanding at a training is that it's where a lot of children are being trafficked from their grandparents. Because a lot of, and I worked with in these cases of, children that don't have their parents. I'm trying to think of the word neglect, abuse, children. And a lot of times their mother and father are not there. They drink and they go out. And their children are left to their grandparents or other relatives. And they expect them, for money, for what they can get from food stamps and, what money, with AFDC or whatever. But I found out that a training in Four Corners Indian Country, we had a training there with law enforcement, FBI, prosecutors, and judges a while back. And I was shocked when the trainer told me that a lot of the children are being trafficked in casinos because their parents are the ones trafficking them. And I don't know if you knew that, but I was really surprised. And I know that with Navajo PD, their law enforcement is way down, the officers. They can't recruit enough. Navajo Nation is a very big, vast reservation, and they're having a hard time keeping their officers. So one of the things that I think you mentioned is the trafficking routes. So with Navajo, I know this because I drive through there and I see it. I-40 from Albuquerque to Flagstaff and Arizona, the trafficking, this is from the drug routes too, because they bring in drugs through the back roads. Like they can go to Flagstaff and they turn off to the city, which is on the reservation, or Page, Arizona, and they go the back routes because they know that Navajo police are there's not enough there. And police officers, to be there on those highways. And every once in a while, they'll catch, Navajo PD will catch some of these drug route people on these drug routes and suspicious vehicles. At one time, they did have white vans out on the reservation, maybe 2 years ago, that were actually taking children off the reservation. So, it's really interesting with all of that. Also, the cultural aspect for the Native youth and the generational trauma they suffered, or their parents from boarding school trauma, where a lot of parents, the grandparents, great-grandparents were forced into boarding schools and abused there. And, that's a touchy subject with some of them. A lot of them have that, the Native people, Navajo, are very oral, they tell oral stories. Some of it are written, but a lot of it is, like with them talking to their families. So I just wanted to point that out for you. Thank you.
No, you bring up so many good points. To your first point about, this last one about boarding schools, you're right. And how many people don't even know that, that isn't even a history or a piece that they have been taught. So I think first understanding that and how that's contributed to the trafficking piece. And not only that, that wasn't even that long ago. I mean, that is still, to me, like newer. I mean, people within generations that are still alive, right, have experience with these things. And so people understanding all of that. I think the other points you bring up, of course, the casinos, you're right. And what does that look like? How can you guys partner with casinos? And the familial trafficking, of family members is very common. And when it is more word of mouth in that way, it's harder even for law enforcement to get involved versus it being online, or there being some kind of trail with it, which can be difficult. And in North Dakota specifically, the casinos, when people were trafficked there, for those offenders that were using the casino, it would get really complicated because now who jurisdictionally is responsible for prosecuting that crime? And oftentimes it would get lost and fall through the cracks at that point. And so offenders then knowing that, right, take advantage of those broken systems that you bring up. So I appreciate your insight on that. And it just provides a more brainstorming for how do we bring in casinos and some of these other areas of need that you brought up into these conversations and make sure we're all working with them too to help combat this and support everyone's efforts. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, one other point I wanted to bring up is the need for a teen shelter on Navajo or even these other reservations. They barely have enough, the nation Navajo barely has enough for inpatient treatment for our people, and they go outside the Navajo Nation. And so anyway, the reason why I say that we need a teen shelter is I have voiced this with the Navajo Tribal Council. I voiced it with law enforcement, criminal justice entities as well. It's just the funding, or they say it's the funding, is a teen shelter for our Native youth, because a lot of the incidents when they run away from home, they're running away from sexual abuse, physical abuse, trauma at home, usually at night, and then they're out in the highways and byways in the middle of the night, and they get picked up, wherever, whoever can pick them up and give them a ride wherever. And I think that's where a lot of the trafficking comes in for the youth.
Absolutely, it does. Yeah. And you're right. It's like they're running away from something, or I always say, or they're running to something. And so, how can we alleviate some of that and educate, provide that support in those things so that doesn't happen? Because you're right. How easy exploitation can happen when you're running and you need your survival needs met. And then of course there's an offender there willing to do that for you. So it's a slippery slope, certainly. And I wish we could have a million shelters in every state and every community, because we all know how full they would be and how much more sleep we might get knowing that these teens have a safe place to rest their head at night. Something else to bring up that I noticed was very helpful is just that honesty. That can be hard, right? Those can be really difficult conversations. But until we talk about the historical kind of turf issues or quote unquote drama, right, between our agencies, the more I've seen just in a variety of MDTs across the country, there's a lot of almost resentment or assumptions that are made. And then the only people who lose in that circumstance are the victims, because we're not communicating because of our own stuff, right? Our own difference in goals or our own historical issues. And so I think it's one thing I've learned, that relationship is so important to say, okay, we know there's been issues. Let's just get those on the table, work through them, and figure out how, again, we're all going to put the victim at the center of what we do and put our own feelings aside, but also do the best to work together. And so my best luck was always getting personal with people, one-on-one phone calls to try to connect and get to know them better. One reservation, I had a judge that was really invested in creating human trafficking codes, but I'd never met him. And so I just said, hey, can I come by the office and get a tour, and then we can grab some lunch? And just having that one-on-one relationship with him really enhanced our motivation and our trust in each other going forward to get some human trafficking codes in place on that reservation. So just thinking about how can we be honest and have these conversations that have needed to happen in order to best meet the needs of victims. So just worth mentioning, how can we get personal, understand each other at a human level? What I noticed and learned too over so much time is when I knew someone on my team personally, having some connection, having some maybe things in common, when something would go wrong in a case, I was still more willing to come back to the table with that person because I knew who they were. I knew their heart. We had some commonalities. And so I didn't just see them as this person I only talked to once a month. When I had to, it was like, well, I know Doug, right? For instance, and Doug and I have these things in common. And so even though I might be mad at Doug, I want to come back to the table for the victim because I know Doug's heart, or I understand him as a person. And so really honing in on this relationship building piece and talking about what hasn't been working. I also think too, understanding who you are on your team. Okay. And sometimes we don't always love the answer to those questions. There's also one thing I do. I just did a resiliency course for 2 days this week. That's where I flew back from. And I had them do a lot of assessments on themselves And then I talk, how can you bring this back to your team and your organizations, right? How can some personal self-reflection and understanding of what it's like to work with you and connect with other people in that way really help you contribute more to your team? So just looking at how do you think people view you on the team, maybe the positive things and the negative things. I always say I'm the squeaky wheel, right? I'm the one that comes in and tries to remind people of some of the things we need to fix, and holding people accountable, and people don't always like that. And so for me, it's how can I find a happy medium between being helpful but also advocating for the change that needs to happen. So just knowing who you are. And one thing, when I do a lot of vicarious trauma and wellness training, I talk about, would you want to work with yourself, right? And if I'm a victim coming into my own office to work with me, would I want to have that interaction? How would that interaction feel? And then taking that further to say, would I want to be my own teammate? Why or why not? So I think to be a part of these informal or formal MDTs and to make them as helpful and functional as possible is just really understanding who you are and your role on that team and how people see you. To keep going with the relationship piece is, again, I already talked about this, but when you connect with communities, they're the experts in their community. And I learned that very quickly. I never went into a community to say, I'm going to tell you what trafficking looks like. It was always, let me learn from you. And now let me work with you to figure out how we, as this task force or this coalition now that exists, this Broken Arrow coalition, how can we come in and help you now that you've taught me about what you're seeing in your community, right? And so understanding that we want to get their approval on things. We want these communities to be involved in making those decisions. And then of course, they're going to be more bought into you in the trust that they have with you because you're looking to them to make those decisions for themselves. Again, asking them to train with you, like we talked about, asking for their opinion and their advice, how they feel about things, that one-on-one connection and relationship building, and just seeing how it will grow. If in my former role in North Dakota, I might get a call in a college would say, hey, can you come and be on a panel for trafficking? And I would say, sure. Can I bring a couple of my colleagues with me? And then I would just talk to the group, this group, this coalition like you guys have, and say, hey, I've got a panel who would like to be on that with me, and let's grab some lunch or let's grab coffee and talk about what we want that to look like. So again, including each other in these opportunities to help learn from each other, but also grow your collaboration. And of course, with these meetings, it's really helpful if you can identify a specific facilitator. Like, is there an organization that makes sense to bring these informal groups together when a suspected case is identified? Or maybe you all decide as a group, like, anyone can bring the case. Here's where we start. Again, with confidentiality in mind, and please know anytime I say that, I understand that there's some approvals and things that need to happen before we can move forward with that. But looking at who makes the most sense to facilitate these meetings, if we can have one point of contact or one organization, but all of us embracing leadership on the team, because we want to be available to each other to offer guidance and the expertise that we have. We want to devote time to this because we all know it's important. That's why you're here. We want to be experts in trafficking and in our community so we can help when we get these phone calls. So having communication skills, having organizational skills, and bringing all of the leadership you all have to your communities is going to help people trust and buy into the process. All right. I think too, one thing that helped me is, even in times where I disagreed, I was always attentive to members' concerns and needs. It's not my group, it's their group, right? It's everybody's group that we're bringing to the table within their community. And for you all here, how can we again kind of work through those past frustrations with the organizations and say we want to be aware of and attentive to the needs and concerns of this group? Because again, our end goal is the same of working with victims. So it's a place where we problem solve, we resolve the conflicts that we absolutely are going to have. We share resources. Another great way to keep momentum is if I have a great resource or a video that comes across my desk, I send it to my teams, right? And then we can have discussion around that. We value everybody's input, right, and what they bring to the team. And oftentimes we have to prioritize and negotiate, and that can be really hard too. Prioritizing what is most important at this time. And oftentimes it comes down to the youth or the adult safety. But then what does that mean to each of us in the group, right? That can be tough too, to understand how do we prioritize and negotiate some of the needs of these victims, especially on a crisis basis. And so thinking about how can we have that conversation prior to a case coming up, so we're more prepared for how we prioritize and what we need to do. So then thinking about where we start, is this kind of old news for you all in terms of when you suspect trafficking, like what are the next steps? Is that kind of old news? You know what needs to be reported and to who?
Do go over your presentation, because a lot of people on here are actually very new as well.
Good to know. Okay. And you all correct me if you know these answers, or you pipe up, because I don't know exactly all the laws, of course, in New Mexico. That's going to look different than North Dakota. But what I can tell you about North Dakota is if you suspected trafficking of a youth in any capacity, whether it's a caregiver or not, that was always a mandated report. The offender did not have to be in a caregiving role. And we had some certain verbiage that we would put on those reports, so it would get routed to the North Dakota task force. So I think it's something within this team to make sure, to your point, right, that people know what this means, especially if they're new. What should be reported and to who, right? What is reportable? What if they're not in a caregiving role? So just looking at what are the best practices. Do you have a hotline that you utilize? One thing I would always encourage people to do, I would say, if you contact CPS with the mandated report, that's fantastic. However, sometimes there's new staff or new people there too, right? Our jobs are oftentimes a revolving door. So please also call our hotline if you're able to take that extra step, because then I for sure get involved in that in some capacity, and then I can follow up with CPS and make sure that I'm offering our support as a team, or I'm offering those next steps in terms of who to communicate with. So in the event it was an adult victim, of course, if there were children involved in some capacity or we're concerned about safety, then we would report it. If not, it would just be talking to that adult client ongoing to say, if you want to report it, we have a team of people that would support that. We're here for you. We believe you. So when you want to report, I have this great friend named Doug, and Doug would come with me to interview you if that is of interest, or you can just sit and ask him questions and then decide later what you want to do. So we already had in our protocol these very clear guidelines and boundaries around how we would talk about and report these things. Also, of course, based on the law in the state and or the reservation where we were, because that's also different. And people assume state law is state law. But that might be something worth you guys all talking about at some point too, of what the differences might be on the reservations and the human trafficking codes that exist or not there as well. So again, just that last point is, how will this or doesn't this change with Native populations, right? If something is or isn't reported, what happens if they're off the reservation when the trafficking is reported versus they're on the reservation? So I would just really encourage you to have these conversations when you develop some type of protocol or response for trafficking, or just general education for the people that join this group.
On the reporting, I'm aware of that because in Navajo, as a prosecutor, anything that is involving, the 5 major crimes is a federal offense. And the FBI gets involved through the Navajo Nation criminal investigators. And these Navajo investigators are law trained as federal officers. And they can take over, or, they can get involved and work with the FBI. We also have the McKinley County Sheriff's Department in certain parts, because Navajo is located in New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah, and McKinley County is with the New Mexico part. We also have Apache County and Navajo County Sheriff's Department. They're very, very involved in Navajo. So you get all these jurisdictional issues, the location, where the offense took place, and it gets kind of it really gets, I don't know how to say to where I've been in that position to what do I do? Where do I go? Yeah. But I still keep going and trying to find the correct way, because Navajo PD will say we can't do it. CI needs to do it. And CI says, okay, we need to get the feds involved. We'll go ahead and then, because sometimes we get some of them that don't want to do that because of all the work, that is involved with, working with all these agencies and law enforcement.
Absolutely. It's overwhelming, or it's out of the norm for them. And so sometimes it's easier just to not get involved, right? So anyone else have anything to add on the reporting?
With the Gallup Police Department. Just to add on that, I primarily work with violent crimes and missing persons. We have a lot of people come here to file police reports because, for whatever reason, they've been either turned away from the Navajo Nation or they don't feel that they can report to the Navajo Nation. But we do take reports from outside jurisdictions. We cannot investigate them because those issues occurred outside of our jurisdiction. But we will file a report and we will forward it to the appropriate agency for investigation. We do that a lot with missing persons, but we can do that for basically any kind of crime. The thing is, the issue is networking, and that's what we got to do. Because it's not, for me personally, it's not, I can't do that, but what can I do? If that's minor, if that's all I can do is file a report and forward it to it, at least I did something. At least the issue is being addressed. It's not being just pushed aside and forgotten.
Exactly.
And I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think both of what you just said is part of why I think this group is so powerful. Is if people don't have the answers, I think what I used to do at the front end of all this is I would kind of stay in my silo and feel like I have to figure it out on my own, or I just, no one is going to figure this out but me, or it just gets pushed to the side. But when I started utilizing my coalition or my teams, such as what you guys have going, I could just say, look, I got a phone call. I have a 16-year-old suspected victim. I have no idea where to go, who to call. Can someone just help me? You know, whether we hop on a call or you just point me in the right direction. And so this group can be that networking, resource sharing space where, again, not necessarily giving out any confidential information or identifying anyone, but just leaning on each other to help, because we don't always know the contact points. And with protocol, if you guys come up with kind of a who to call and where to go in these circumstances, that always changes, right? Because we know laws shift, or people that are involved change, or the jurisdictional things can change. For example, on some reservations in North Dakota, the FBI was the lead on trafficking cases, and in other it was tribal PD. So it's just never knowing what and when and how things change, and so always knowing that this group exists and we can rewrite things and at least have a calling or a contact point is so helpful. In terms of, you know, kind of moving forward and getting started based on this section here, you know, you already have these meetings in place. So it's just figuring out what types of meetings you want, trial and erroring some protocol or points of contact. You know, you're already engaging with each other and communicating and coming to the table. So it's just who's missing, right? Who needs to be here? Who are the facilitators of these things? And also looking at who in your community isn't necessarily the boss, right? Or the leaders of organizations, but who are champions, who are people that can make change, that are impacting communities, that are agents of change, and how can those louder voices that people trust and engage in get involved somehow to help you with this, or maybe to get buy-in from the agency that doesn't want to come to the table, or connect with someone that hasn't previously been involved. So just thinking about these types of things when you're advocating to push this forward, of who should be here, how do we communicate, you know, who can make an impact as we go forward. So of course, once you talk about the facilitator or the mission statement, if you want to do this, it's that vision of, you know, what guides your work, what does success look like? And so if when you haven't done this or you look to do this, here are just some questions that I like to start with MDTs, right? Just kind of brainstorming some of this, like, who are we, right? What would people say about us? Who benefits from us existing? So once you start throwing around some of these ideas for mission and vision, you might get a really honed in approach on what you'd want a mission statement to be, or what your goals of this group are, and really what your focus is. You know, again, furthermore questions: what benefits are we bringing to the kids and the communities you serve? How do you benefit society? How are you collaborating with Native populations and reservations? So kind of digging deeper into your first tasks of, like, why are we here? What do we do? What's our elevator pitch? You know, when do people call us? What do we bring to the table? What resource do we have here? Of course, we've talked about goals, tasks, and that's easier to do once we have this vision of who we are. Always having another meeting on the schedule. You guys already have that with this larger coalition, right? So check that off the box. But I think two things that are really important not to overlook is what's already functioning. So I knew in North Dakota, there was one specific reservation that they had a functioning meeting already, where the United States Attorney's Office would attend, and the FBI and the tribal providers, and they would get together monthly already. That was an existing group. And so instead of me coming in and having to reform all these relationships and to put another meeting on everyone's calendar. That was a space where I had some trusted people already involved that they could invite me into that space as just another supplemental support with that human trafficking lens. So thinking about what already exists, what's functioning, we don't always need to reinvent the wheel. How can we utilize the resources or the meetings or the people that are already gathering to do some of this work, right? And to just be involved in that space. And then what would your expectations be of the client? So asking clients, like, what would you expect from this group, right? What would be ideal for you to get out of this MDT existing? Of course, their families and then the team members. So even going around the circle and for you guys to talk about, like, what is our expectation of each other at the end of the day, right? What do we want to get out of this group from each other? What do we expect in terms of participation and response to victims? What is my expectation of each one of your agencies in the event we encounter a victim? And so having a really clear idea can also help formulate your tasks in each one of your roles and responsibilities. So again, when we talk about what's already functioning, some questions to ponder, how are agencies already working together and intersecting on these types of violent crimes? Also paying attention to the trends and the gaps, right? If casinos is a trend or something that's really popular, if there's a specific service that's a gap, or maybe the human trafficking codes are a gap, looking at those things and having some focus on that. And then what existing team or collaboration that's already out there can be used to develop your protocol that you want in response, which we already kind of talked about. So just looking at some other spaces, you could creatively think about how to engage with that group to kind of just incorporate yourself into that if it makes more sense. So this is another piece that I found very overwhelming. When I started in my role as the human trafficking navigator, we had nothing. That was kind of my job, was to just create teams and responses, right, to trafficking and resources. And so things I would ask is what kinds of teams do we already have existing? What's missing, right? And how do we make this as efficient as possible? Because all of us are already overworked and have way too many cases on our plate and job duties, right? And so how can we be efficient? And so different types of meetings to consider that you can talk about. You already have what you're doing now is this community coalition. From that, do you have a crisis response where maybe those of you that are kind of boots on the ground, first points of contact on a protocol if a case comes up, you have a crisis response team and a debriefing team that after those cases close, whether successfully or unfortunately not, sometimes does that response team have a debrief group, right? That we talk about that so we can do better than the next time, which can kind of go into that protocol team. Do you have different teams based on youth and adult victims? In North Dakota, it was kind of 50-50. And again, I would always ask the community what they wanted. Some wanted separate team meetings for youth and adults and separate protocol. Some communities said, you know what, a lot of our victims have children or a lot of our child victims are almost an adult. Therefore, we feel like we should all be together at the table with one protocol. And again, it's what that community decides makes sense. Same with sex versus labor trafficking. Are you guys focused on both or just focused on the sex trafficking piece? So what types of teams do you want, right? All together or separate teams or separate meetings? And then thinking about, of course, undocumented individuals who, of course, we're going to work with as victims of trafficking, and then your bordering communities and reservations. So not necessarily just your bordering reservations between reservations and non, but also the states. For example, I lived in Fargo, North Dakota, which is right next to Moorhead, Minnesota. And obviously we saw a lot of clients and cases go in between Fargo and Moorhead, which would be crossing state lines. So every 3 months, the team I developed in Fargo would meet with the Minnesota team, and we would all come together, and there would be 2 navigators, right? Myself and the Minnesota navigator, to talk about protocol and talk about our response, because we know these clients and cases not only now might involve various jurisdictions between reservations and non-reservations, but now we're talking 2 different states, right? So how do we all work together and proactively connect with other states and find their task forces or their coalitions for trafficking and saying, hey, what are you doing? How can we work together and have a proactive plan in place when I need to call your interstate compact office, or, because a youth ran from my state to your state? What can we already have in existence? So these are just various things to consider when you guys are maybe getting more in the development of what types of groups you want, what you want to come from the coalition you have here today. Okay, I know I'm running out of time, so I'm cruising through a couple more things. Of course, just with bordering communities like we just talked about, right? What are the dynamics now that you're involving other states or other communities? And then are they also doing those person-centered trauma-informed approaches? Because I've been burned a few times where I work with maybe another community and they're like, yeah, we're trauma-informed. And then you both go maybe meet with a client when that makes sense or is appropriate, and they're not very trauma-informed. And so how do we have kind of that awkward but honest conversation about like, how do we treat victims? How do we view victims? And then specifically, how do we view Native victims and reservations and in the trafficking that occurs there? And of course, with trafficking reservations, we've talked already about the laws and codes that might be different. I would always suggest in this group having space to educate each other on what's the difference between laws and human trafficking codes. What does one reservation have versus another, right? Because all of that could be different. We already talked about the different law enforcement that may or may not be involved in those cases. And Ella brought up some, a good point too on the various jurisdictions in one case. And then, of course, what grant dollars do or don't exist. And then what turf stuff comes up, right? Because that is one of those honesty pieces of we got to talk about the white elephants. And sometimes we get turfy around funding and grant dollars. It happens, right? Oftentimes we're all competing for the same pot of money, but we all still need each other and we all still need that service. So whether I provide it or you provide it, it's so important. And so let's at least talk about it and proactively plan for the considerations that will come up when we're working in a variety of different jurisdictions. And of course, when we're working with reservations or undocumented children, how will this change your MDT approach, right? Who should be aware, what should we be aware of? What are the positive things about this? What are the negative things or maybe issues or barriers that come up? How does that change protocol? How are we ensuring that we understand the generational and historical trauma like we've talked about? And then again, culturally, each reservation is different. So we need to reach out to each one separately versus making assumptions that all of them function the same or have the same culture, have the same laws. Lessons I learned, if I haven't already talked about, is that each reservation was very different. So the way that we ran meetings, whether they wanted to burn sage at the beginning of the meeting or have prayer, or they wanted me to provide something, right? Like oftentimes it was like, if you're facilitating a meeting or inviting them to that, you're bringing something to share with everybody. So those are just little things I learned, not only about the laws that differ, but again, the culture being very different with each reservation I would work with. I made a point to go learn from them, again, saying, you're the expert, help me understand some of the issues in the past, right? What historical things do I need to be aware of as I'm trying to provide support, to this community. So understanding historical relationships, the grants, the barriers, the frustrations. I noticed I covered a lot of ground, covering half of a state in a variety of communities. And so I opted to try to do Zoom when I could. Also, the weather isn't great in North Dakota more than half the year. So sometimes it was hard to schedule a time because in the winter I would have to reschedule them a lot. But what I learned specifically about the reservations I worked with is that in-person meeting made a massive difference in the connection and the trust building. Just making that extra effort to have that in-person meeting made a difference for me working with reservations. Again, we've talked about that, including tribal contacts proactively. I didn't always do that because I assumed by calling CPS that CPS off the reservation was doing that, and they weren't, right? And so how can I include tribal contacts on the front end so I already have them in the event I am involved in with the victim's case? Understand those jurisdictional differences like we've talked about. Proactive understanding of the services that exist for Native populations. Again, there was that example I gave of the youth who wanted Native specific mentorship and some art, right? And having an elder come in to meet with her. And we didn't know who to turn to or who could help us with that. I would also say too, finding the right provider, because if I tell a Native client, like, I've got services, you're going to go meet with a white therapist in her office 3 days a week. That's probably not the way that they would like to connect and heal, right? It might be, but if we're asking them, if we're being person-centered, we're asking that client what they want. And oftentimes it could be a sweat lodge. It could be that elder mentorship, those things that I think the more we understand and proactively know what resources we need to have available within this group, the better off we are in terms of enhancing our relationships with clients. And then finding the people that want to work together. Sometimes I would have a contact point, and they weren't interested. And it's you know, who else from that organization? Again, not necessarily the boss or the leader, but who's the agent of change? Who's the champion there that gets this and wants to be involved? So for me, it was always finding the people that wanted to be involved in this and work with me, even if they weren't the ones that were, you know, told they could be a part of protocol or they did respond to trafficking. You can still lean on them, right, to communicate with their own agency or to be an agent of change within their space. Barriers, we've talked about some of these already, but just things to plan for. I'm not going to go through each of these, but again, in this group, or if you guys kind of come up with different types of teams or coalitions, really just talking about what barriers can we expect, and let's just talk about them. Let's prepare for them, okay? That is absolutely going to happen. For example, one that came up for me a lot was some people believing firmly that the best way to keep youth victims safe is to lock them up for a while they get sober and they get, you know, some food, and they're safe for a while, and we kind of establish a plan for them. Other people on the team would say, under no circumstance ever do we lock up victims of trafficking, period. So it, like, that's a barrier, right? That's something that proactively just have those conversations about what is your agency expectation for things like child safety and what that means, or how does your agency view victims of trafficking? Do they even think that that's a thing? Because there are still agencies out there that think this is all sex work and all consensual. And so just understanding, right, some of these barriers that we are going to come in contact with, talking about them proactively. So of course, when we're looking at protocol, we've talked a lot about this already because I'm cruising through this so quickly. But one thing just to point out we haven't talked about is that cross-discipline training, talking about each person's role, what they're all responsible for in their agency. Do they have an internal human trafficking protocol that we can learn from, or maybe not reinvent the wheel and take something from? How to, again, their organization view trafficking, how do they instill, you know, person-centered approaches? So really kind of learning from each other, each discipline, and what that looks like. What are the expectations from each of us? For example, one big barrier I had was law enforcement didn't know that I had this like ethical standard to uphold confidentiality. They thought I was purposefully being difficult, not telling them anything about clients, and that provided a lot of space for division. When I realized that, and I could say, hey, like, I have confidentiality to uphold, here's what a social work license is, or here's what my policies are. So just thinking about how you talk about each response from each discipline. And then how are you guys assessing for trafficking? Again, are you focused on one specific type and age of trafficking, or any and all kinds? Is there a specific tool that you use, whether you've created one or you use a vetted, you know, national tool? So even having conversation about the assessments that you use will be really helpful. I think we've talked about most of this, but again, I'm happy to share these slides with you if you would like them. One thing too, oftentimes we just throw youth into the placement facility that's available, which sometimes we have to, right? We don't really have a choice, unfortunately, or we put them with the provider that doesn't have a wait list, but they're not the right provider. Maybe they don't understand historical trauma. Maybe they don't understand trafficking. So then our victims oftentimes end up even comforting the therapist because the therapist isn't the right person for that. So how are we including and vetting the right provider for our Native populations and just for trafficking in general? This is a really great resource. I have some friends in Minnesota that work at the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office. They do a lot of work with victims in general of crime. They do a lot with data collection. I did send over some of their handouts and their contact points, so please use them. They would also love to come and talk with you at a meeting as well if this is of interest to you. They also talk, obviously, here a lot about healing practices. And so just another organization that can be a resource for you all on a national scale. I think I'm out of time, but the rest of this really is just how do we now evaluate how our coalition is running. So at some point you all talk about like what is successful, what isn't, how do we evaluate that, how to take care of each other. You already have someone talking about vicarious trauma next month. That's something I always incorporate in my teams, is sending out a video or an assessment or checking in on how everybody's doing and caring about our well-being, because these are very tough cases. So kudos to you all for being involved in what you do. So if this is helpful, here's some ideas for an agenda, just some things. Okay, what can we talk about at our next meetings? You can have this slide. If this helps, just give some insider ideas for talking points in terms of how you want to develop MDTs. So this was really helpful as just a stepping stone. So don't forget to focus on the success of your clients either. I think after someone discharges, if I hear from them and a client calls me or texts me and says, hey, here's where I'm at, I'm doing great, tell people hi, doing that, you know, not forgetting to celebrate the success, because we often don't hear about the reward or the success of the work that we do. So sharing that with your team when we hear from the families' lives that we've impacted positively. Okay, I think that's it.